All right. Well, if you were here last week, what'd you think of the jumbo version of me? Thank you. So yeah, I don't know if it was in this service or the one after this, but Tom said that I finally got to live out my dream of being over 6 feet tall. And he's right, it's true, but I wasn't here to experience it, so I don't know what it was like. So there's a church, it's called The Hills. It's in Fort Worth, Texas. You might remember the pastor, his name is Rick Atchley. He was here over the summer with his wife, Jamie. They came up during the welcome announcements part of the service. They're a church that helped get us started. So when we started the church back in 2020, in 2019, we went there and we asked for help because, it takes like resources to start a church. And they got behind us and they were willing to dream about what could happen here on Long Island. And so that's part of their DNA, helping new churches start. And every year they do this thing, it's called Harvest Sunday, where they talk about new churches and things like that all over the world. And all the money that comes in for that one day goes out to help start new churches. Churches like us when we started in 2020. So they asked me to come back and talk about community church, like you guys, on Harvest Sunday and share some stories just to show really what can happen when you get behind something, like believe that something could happen somewhere. And so it was cool. In one day, they raised $2.5 million just to start new churches. So it was really cool, and I think for me, it was an important reminder, and I hope for you too, that it's an important reminder that what's happening here is really special, but it is part of something that is so much bigger. And it's been going on for the last 2,000 years, and community church is just a small part in this big church Jesus movement. So it's cool, cool experience. So when I was younger, like I used to go trick-or-treating on Halloween. I'd go with my brother, my sister, my friends, whatever. We'd go, we'd hit all the houses, and it'd be a mad dash. We'd run from house to house. Usually we'd get all the same houses, but then there'd be a point where at the end of the night, we all sit down, and we dump out the pillowcase, like look at the goods, like what you got, and we'd compare candy, and usually it was all the same stuff, but every once in a while, there'd be something that the other people had that I didn't have, and I'd be like, where'd you get that, right? And I'd be like, oh, is that house over there? It turns out I'd missed the house, and I'd be like, how did I miss that, right? It's like this feeling of like, I missed it, wish I could go back. Or if you want a more mature example of this feeling, if you've ever been to a wedding, right? You ever go to a wedding where there's all those different stations, there's like one station's like a little buffet, then maybe there's a little dessert station, maybe like, vegetables or seafood, like little tables spread out. At some weddings, they do this, right? You ever, like, after the wedding, talk to someone that found something that you didn't, It's like, oh, did you try the French toast station? It's like, what French toast, right? Like, oh, it was by the bathroom, and you never saw it and you missed it and you can't go back. Well, I had that, like, I can't believe I missed it moment this past week. On Monday night, our group was meeting together. We have community groups here, in case you don't know. We often talk about the message on Sunday. There are some questions. We go a little further into the content. And I don't write those questions. The teacher who attends our church writes those questions. Her name's Melissa Muma. She's in my group, and we read this question. And as soon as I read it, I was thinking man, I missed it. Like, there is a point, there's an aspect of this story that we talked about last week, if you were here, that we missed. But the great thing about it is that we can go back. And it's such a big thing that we miss. Like, we miss, the house with the full-size candy bars, Like, we miss the station with the guy with the heat lamp, with the pink meat lamp where they cut it nice for you at the wedding. Like, that station, you don't want to miss that station. We miss that station in the story. And it's so big and so important, especially if you're someone who's, building this framework of what it means, what it looks like to follow Jesus. This is such a big, big aspect of it. And so we have to go back. So we've pressed pause on the series that's supposed to be coming up. We're supposed to start today. But I told you last week we were just doing a 1-week thing. It's actually a 2-week thing because this is such a big thing. But I'm excited to share it with you because it's one of those things that can totally transform the way that you understand God and faith and church and Jesus and how this whole thing works together. All right? The concept that we're talking about, the idea that we're talking about is what we might call the pursuit of God. The pursuit of God. Now, I don't know about you, maybe you didn't wake up this morning thinking like, oh, can't wait to talk about the pursuit of God. Or maybe you're not even quite sure what that means, like the pursuit of God, what's the deal with that? If you're not totally on board with the whole idea, just like hold on to that for just a second, right? Humor me. So think about a pursuit. You ever like wanted something so bad, you know, where it's like, what do I got to do? Like, how far do I have to go? What hoops do I need to jump through to get that thing? Or even that person, right? You ever pursued someone, right? Someone you like, someone you want to be with, and it's this feeling like, what do I have to do, right? When my wife, Allie, and I, we first met, I had just transferred. So I was in college. I went for 1 semester at one school, and then I transferred. After just 1 semester, I transferred to another school, and I had one friend at this new school, and so I texted my friend when I got here. I was like, hey, you're the only guy I know. Can we, like, let me into your group? And so he's like, yeah, sure, no problem. So we're going out tonight. We go out that night, me and this guy and his friend group, and there's this girl in the group. And I was like, pursuit begun. But I didn't want to be that creepy guy that just shows up and starts, like, asking girls out, right? Like, it literally was the first day that I got there. And so I was like, okay, I got to play, like, the long game here. So I'm trying to be strategic with my approach. I made a second friend. His name was Bobby. I was like, Bobby, you got to, like, get behind the scenes, find some information out for me. Like, I need to know if there's any potential for this relationship. And he's like, okay, great, yeah, so no problem. So he goes, he, like, talks to her, asks some questions, comes back to me a few days later. He's like, I got news. I was like, all right, what's the deal? Yes? No? He's like, no chance. All right, okay, fine. Well, my mom would tell you growing up that I had trouble taking no for an answer, and the same is true in this situation. So I was like, okay, how do I do this, right? Like, what do I have to do? How do I have to be? They say you shouldn't change for people, but I didn't have a problem with that. I'm like, I could be whatever you want me to be. You don't want me to wear my boots? I had this big lumberjack jacket. I found out she hated it, but it was so comfortable. It was like a big blanket. So anyway, I'm like trying to figure out what it takes to get through to this girl. And one day, we're all hanging out with the group, and she needed a ride, so I picked her up from her dorm, and we're about to go meet up with everyone. She's like, I don't really want to go out with everyone. And I was like, okay, want me to drop you off back at the place I just picked you up? And she was like, no. So I was like, all right. I felt like a setup, you know. So I was like, all right, well, maybe, want to go out, grab a bite to eat. Like, we don't have to go out with everyone if you want to go out with everyone. She's like, sure. So we go out, and I'm like, okay, I feel like, maybe this is going to be a thing. So at the end of the night, as I'm dropping her off at her dorm, I timed this conversation perfectly. I was going to, like, go in for the kill, let her know my intentions. And so we're approaching the dorm. I wanted to make sure I finished up right as we got to the dorm, because if she says no, then it's going to be awkward. So I want to make sure she get out quick. So we're driving, and I was like, hey, so, I just wanted to talk to you. I've really been enjoying the time we've spent together, and I'd love to see, like, where this relationship could go. And if you feel the same way, that's great. We could see what happens. If not, then we could just be friends. Doesn't have to be weird, but you could use that if you want. And then I said, just to be a gentleman, I was like, yeah, but I also had a lot of time to think about how I was going to say this, and I don't want you to feel like pressure to give me an answer right now. And so she was like, okay, and she got out of the car. And that was frustrating. But if you know how the story ends, or if you're here when the service started, we ended up getting married and everything was great. But it was this pursuit that went on for a while. And there's that feeling like, what do I got to do? What do I got to do to get through to you? How do I have to phrase it? Like, it's this feeling like there's a future that I want, and I want you to agree to it, right? Have you ever been there? You ever that feeling of wanting to be with someone, or even just wanting something and being willing to do whatever to acquire it? All right, hold on to that feeling and take that feeling into the story. The story that we looked at last week was the story of Peter. Peter is someone who's like helped launch the church. He got the church going. Like Peter as in Saint Peter. He was one of Jesus' best friends. And he was a big time influential person in the life of the church. But we saw Peter go from like, not for me, I'm not into your stuff, to all in. And the question we asked last week was, how do you get there? How do you get from not being into it to totally sold out on this life-changing Jesus relationship? How do you get there? So we looked at Peter's story, how he went from not for me to all in. And here's the story. If you weren't here last week, this is it. If you were here last week, this will be like a refresher. It says this. It says, Luke records it this way. He says, one day Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. That's also the Sea of Galilee, in case you're familiar with that. The people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. Jesus was super famous at this point. He was famous for his teachings, for the things that he did. So there's tons of people crowding around him, and he's continuing to teach, and it says, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. And so Jesus decides to get into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon. Simon, this is Peter. They also called him Simon. He didn't have a last name, so they just gave him 2 names. Just kidding. That's not how that works. And he asked him to put out a little from the shore. So this is a real practical thing. Jesus sees a boat. He's like, hey, can I use that boat? He jumps in because there's a crowd, and so he wants to create some space. Teachers did this in the ancient world. He'd get in the boat, and he'd teach from the boat, so everyone's on the crowd. Now he could see everybody. And so that's what he's doing here. So he sat down in the boat, and he taught people from the boat. After this, when he finished speaking, he said to Simon, he said, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Simon answers, Peter answers, he says, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I'll let down the nets. Peter, he's been out fishing all night, right? This was normal in the ancient world. They would fish at night because the water would cool at the surface. The fish would come to the top of the surface, and they'd scoop them out with their nets. He's been fishing all night. He's caught nothing. This is extremely frustrating. It's like working all night long. Imagine working a night shift and coming home with no paycheck. So he's frustrated. Now he's cleaned out his nets, right? He's already cleaned the nets. And Jesus is like, hey, let's go fishing out again in the daytime. He's already caught nothing. The fish aren't biting. And now Jesus is like, let's go out at a time that doesn't seem super convenient. And Peter's not into this. He's not on board with the idea. He's not thrilled, but he gives him an okay, fine. He's like, Master. This doesn't mean Lord. This is a term of respect. It's like, Sir. He's like, Sir, we've worked hard all night, haven't caught anything, but because you say so, fine. He's got low expectations. He's not expecting big things. He doesn't see the point of this, but he's like, I will. Literally, if you say so, fine. And if you know the story, it says, when he did this, when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they got other people involved. It says they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats with fish, so full that they began to sink. Right? There's this miraculous thing that they see, and Peter's life changes forever from that point on. Now, he still failed. He still messed up. There were still ups and downs, but that was the thing that changed him. That was the moment that changed him. What we said last week, and this is so important, especially if you weren't here, the question is, how do we go from not for me to like all in? What does that journey look like? A lot of times when we think about that, we think it requires a leap of faith, a big dramatic, I'm sold out, I'm all in 100%, but we don't get that from Peter. We get not a leap, we get a step, and it's not a step of faith, it's a step in doubt. Like, I don't see the point of this, I've got low expectations, but okay, fine. And he does, and on the other side of that okay, fine, is an unbelievable story. And so the idea last week that I wanted to leave you with was that growth happens, this whole thing, it happens most often in small steps even with doubts. not in big leaps. Sometimes there are big leaps, but those are the exception. More often than not, it's a small step, and okay, fine, even if you have your reservations. And from there, that's when we see real change, real life transformation. So the implications of that for us as a church, and this is recap, but we say here, you can belong before you believe. You can be sitting in your seat right now thinking, I believe none of this. And we're cool with you being here because we feel like you need to have space. People need space to consider things and not show up and feel like, now I got to pretend to believe all this stuff I don't believe. So you can belong before you believe. We also say you have permission to be in progress because Jesus gave permission to be in progress to his followers. So that's a big thing. Growth happens in small steps, not big leaps. But that was last week. Here's the thing that I missed. Here's the table with the prime rib and the meat that we overlooked by the bathroom. It says, we read this already. Here's the verse. It says, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and he asked him to put out from the shore. You see who the initiator is in this story? The pronoun here, it's Jesus. It says, Jesus got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and Jesus asked him to put out a little from the shore. Jesus was the initiator of this relationship. Peter was going out fishing because that's what he did. He was a fisherman. He was out on the water. He pulled up to shore, and Jesus shows up and starts asking him questions. He asks him to take these small steps. If you look at the way Jesus interacts with just about all the people he interacts with in the Gospels, it's him constantly, repeatedly inviting people in to come and see, come follow me, literally, come follow me. In other words, if we're talking about the pursuit of God, this is so important, so important. The pursuit of God, this is possessive here. Like this is God's pursuit. In other words, God is in pursuit of you. Jesus was in pursuit of Peter, of Simon. This is how he operates with people. You will never pursue God to a greater extent than he's already pursuing you. In everything we believe, in all the texts that we read, God is the initiator of the relationship. It's our job or our ability, our opportunity to choose whether or not to respond, to give him a yes or even an okay, fine, or a no. And the reason this is so important is because often we see God as someone way up out there, and if I'm gonna do the church thing, I gotta get my act together, I gotta get my ducks in a row, I gotta start doing this, I gotta stop doing this, I gotta try to do this, and maybe then God will accept me. Really, all those things, that's language of my pursuit of God. When God is in pursuit of us, as we are where we are, he is the one who wants to be with us. If you look at the story of me and Allie, right? The one who has the feeling of what do I gotta do to get through to you? The one who's showing the persistence, it's God. It's not us. You and I are the ones being pursued by God. And I don't know about you, but my default, the mode I fall into, the incorrect belief that I find myself over and over again believing is that I've got to do something to wow God to get his attention. When all throughout my everyday activities, God is trying to get mine. But it takes an okay, fine. And you and I may not realize it when we choose to turn him down. Peter's story, it could have very easily been Peter could say oh yeah, one day I went fishing, we caught nothing, came back, Jesus was on the shore and he was teaching. And he asked me to go fishing again. I said no, because we had been fishing all night. I wasn't going fishing in the daytime. And then I went home, went and took a nap. And Peter would just fade into oblivion. I don't think he would have realized everything could have changed that day if I would have let Jesus into my boat. if I had given him the ability to do something in my life, if I had given him the okay, fine. There's a pastor who, he actually passed away, his name's Tim Keller. He said that the difference, there, like most religions, the framework of most religions goes something like, if I obey God, God will accept me. Like if I do enough, God will accept me. If I check the boxes, God will accept me. If I obey him, he'll accept me. Like in that setup, we are the initiators. But he's like, but the story of Jesus, what we call the gospel, is that because of him, we are loved and embraced and accepted with all our broken pieces, bad habits, doubts, issues. And because of that, I obey him. Like I listen to him. He's proven to me that he's for me. He's in my corner. And so I want his direction in my life. It begins with acceptance, and then there's a response. He is the pursuer, and we are the responders. And this is so big. It is so, so big. Another guy, his name's C.S. Lewis. He's the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He's a great thinker. He's one of those guys, if you read what he writes, you have to read it real slow, and often twice. And plus, he's British, which makes him even smarter. But he's like, if you want to get to know God better, and you have this desire to get to know him, and one day you sit down and you pray and ask God to show himself to you, to help you get to know him better. He's like, God, in that equation, in that story, God is both the giver of the desire and the fulfillment of it. Like, in other words, sometimes we talk as if we're searching for God. And even in my story, sometimes I'm like, there's this moment in life where I decided I want answers. I want to know. Like, that's where my pursuit of God began. What Jesus would say, what the writers of the New Testament would say is, you only felt that way because God's been poking at you. He's the one who draws us in, and we have the opportunity to respond. What's amazing? I hear versions of this over and over and over again. Some of you in passing or in talking or will sit down, you'll tell me your story. It's like, I just saw this thing and I felt like, I really should. Like, or I passed by and I thought, what would happen if I went in there? Or maybe I'll bring my kids to that. And I've spoken to people who have literally stood outside the building and just looked and been like, I don't know. Should I go in? Should I not go in? And there's this deep internal drawing and resistance happening. You don't do that at the bakery, or like the gas station. You're like, should I fill up my tank or not? But there's something deep within you that is drawing you in, and you have the opportunity to say, okay, fine, or no, not for me. Like, God is the one who's pulling us in. And I'm not saying to community church. I'm talking about a relationship with him. And so for me, I'm like, okay, well, what does this look like, right? Like, okay, it sounds good. God is asking for an okay, fine. Where? Where is this going to happen in my life? And what's so great about Peter's story, we'll put it back up here. Here, it says, Jesus got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, Peter. He went to his boat. The great thing about this, especially where we are, is so many people who go to this church already have boats. Just kidding. Peter was a fisherman. He was in that boat every single day. It was his world. And he had just shown up with no fish. It was an immediate area of disappointment and frustration. But it was his own boat. Like, he knew that boat like the back of his hand. And I'm willing to bet, if you were to ask him, like, hey, Peter, where do you think your life's going to change forever? Where do you think you're going to experience the divine? I don't think he'd look at that boat, like that old hunk of junk covered in fish guts, and be like, that's where everything's going to change, where the Son of God is going to invite me to follow him. But that's where it happens. It's not in the, extraordinary. It's in the ordinary. It's in the mundane, in the routine. It's probably the least likely place we are to look for him. So my question is, like, where's your boat? What's your equivalent? All right, sometimes we think like we'll find God up on a mountain after I take a 30-day vow of silence, which my wife would love. And there, like maybe God will break through. I read a story about a pastor who's like, I locked myself in my office for 48 hours. I didn't come out. I didn't eat or drink. I just and he's like, and I got nothing from it. Like we think it's out there, and sometimes maybe it is. I don't know. I'm not going to put God in a box. But when we see what Jesus actually did, he showed up in the everyday, mundane, routine, not spectacular situation. So maybe for you, like your boat is your marriage. Maybe that's a point of frustration in your life. Maybe God wants to be let into that boat. There's a place of disappointment for Peter. He was looking for fish. Do you know what Jesus gave him? Fish. Like maybe there's something that you're looking for in an area of life, and God would say, like, let me into that. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of people developing real faith in every area of life, and it started with a frustration in one area of life. Or maybe it's parenting. Like maybe parenting is a struggle. Maybe it's a source of anxiety and inadequacy, and it's an opportunity for you to let God into your boat, that boat. God is in pursuit of you where you already are, in what you're already doing. In the normal, everyday areas of life. For us, there's a couple in our small group, and during one of our discussions, one of them said that they started praying in the morning together as a family. Like that was just a step that they took. Like before everyone got out of the house, they would just like huddle up real quick and say a quick prayer. Allie and I heard that, and we like both individually were like, yeah, like that's something we need to start doing. Why? Because for us, that's a crazy, stressful part of the day, right? It's like everyone's going around, running around like crazy. It's like, the bus is coming. It's nuts. And we're like, maybe there's an opportunity for growth here. Maybe there's an opportunity for peace here. And I would have thought, honestly, my kids would hate it. But now, like right before the bus comes, I'm like, hey, we're going to pray. And they come running from their bedrooms, and it's become a moment that's like sacred for us. They look forward to. There's nothing profound happening. We're just asking God for help. Maybe you start doing this with your family. Maybe you start doing it in your marriage. And I'll tell you right off the bat, if you've never done it, it's awkward. It's awkward. Even with someone you might be super comfortable with, if you've never prayed together, it feels weird and clunky for everyone, no matter how spiritual you are. But eventually, it starts to not feel so weird. And so embrace it. Recognize it's going to be weird, but let's go for it. Okay, fine. My expectations are low, and I don't see the point, but okay, fine. You might be amazed to see what could happen from that small step, that small response of God's pursuit of you. Maybe it's in the car on the way to work. Maybe you decide you're going to take that time and use that time to grow in your faith. For me, when my daughter was born 10 years ago, I would feed her in the morning with the little like porridge powder mix. And I didn't like it. I had to wake up super early. She was up very early, and it was my job. I had her in this little seat thing, and I'd like sit there and stir it, and I just resented her because she was up so early. And at one point I was like, you know what if like maybe this time doesn't have to be a point of frustration. Maybe it can be like an opportunity to grow. So I just started listening to audiobooks and little messages online, sermons from other churches. Started listening to them early in the morning. That for me that started a habit that's still going on today. Like just about everything I know, I learned in the first 2 hours or 3 hours of the day. I'm not feeding my daughter anymore. She can do that herself at this point. But it started something. God's in pursuit of you, maybe to begin a relationship that you don't have with him. Or it may be that he's in pursuit of a deeper relationship with you. He wants to grow with you. He wants to help you grow with him. You will never pursue God to a greater extent than he's already pursuing you. And often they come in gentle nudges. Jesus is like, can we use your boat? Yes or no? He could have said no. Jesus would say, that's fine, I can walk on water. But he's let him in. He let him in. We're just about out of time. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. But here's the picture I want to leave you with. And honestly, if I could be transparent, my struggle with believing that God is in pursuit of me, it's because I know me. I know my problems. I know my doubts. I know my struggles. I know my failures. I know the things I was trying to stop doing that I started doing again. I know my tendencies. I know it all. And I know that God knows those things too. And if I were him, I don't know that I'd pursue me. But the Apostle Paul writes in his letter to a church in Rome, he writes that while we were still sinners, that's when Jesus died for us. In other words, he's in essence, he's trying to help us picture us at our absolute worst, like the worst we've been, when we want nothing to do with God. He's like, see yourself in that moment and know that's when Jesus will show you the greatest expression of his pursuit of your heart. Jesus going to the cross, it was to die for our sins, but it was also to show us just how far he would go for us. And he does that when we're at our absolute worst. If you know Peter's story, they had this meeting on the beach. They were together for 3 more years. And Peter learned, and he grew, and he succeeded, and he failed. And then Jesus was arrested, and he was beaten. And he was on his way to the cross, and 3 times Peter was asked, like, are you with that guy? And 3 times Peter said, I don't know him. Like Peter, when Jesus needed him most, Peter denied him not once, not twice, but 3 times. And then he watched him die. And then 3 days later, Jesus came back. And one day, Peter was out fishing. And he caught nothing. And as he began to row back to shore, do you know who was on the beach waiting for him? After his greatest failure, he shows up again to say, like, I am still in pursuit of you. That's what he's like. You will never pursue God to an extent that is greater than his pursuit of you. So will you let him into your boat?